Let's raise our hands to Father Yahweh. Father Yahweh, this is Kwanzaa, fine to see you, the last day's witness, Yisrayl Hawkins, your son, our high priest, Yeshua Messiah, along with the men of your class, giving you great thanks, Father, for this understanding and the opportunity that you're giving to us as protection and all the facilities and all of this things that are necessary for both doing the work and keeping your laws, and it's actually quite a complex thing that we're doing here under the direction of Yisrayl Hawkins, and we do thank you for him. We pray that he gets a full use of his subconscious mind. We also pray for the sick in your house, that they're healed, that this message continues to go out, and also for the great Kwan Yudidia that he's released, and that all the prisoners who would like to keep your feasts and keep your laws would be released soon. As we know, they will be, according to prophecy. In Yeshua Messiah's name, we thank you for all things. Hallelujah, Yahweh. Praise Yahweh. Okay, we're on page 190 of the 10th book of Israel, part 1. He who rules is Yahweh, which is what Israel means. And this is all what we're striving to become ourselves. Please be seated. We're on page, let me see, I guess we're going to start on page 190, which is chapter 20. And we're going to start with verse 3. And Pastor says here, but public schools, and he's reading an article, new violence against teachers. It says, during a dance, at a Gwynn Park High School in Brandywine, I think that's Minnesota, an assistant principal had his throat slashed by a former student who came to make trouble. Teachers at East St. Louis, Illinois school system have become so terrified, says school board president, that 3 out of 4 are carrying guns to class. 3 out of 4 teachers now, they're getting that scared, and they're allowing this, but as you know, President Barack Obama says all this is going to do is lead to more violence. And they have no solutions. They say, they plainly say this here in this article. They have no solutions. A new wave of violence is sweeping. A new wave now of violence is sweeping the U.S. classrooms, yet the incidence of burglary, larceny, assault, and even murder is rising in all public schools. More and more teachers are quitting their jobs out of the sheer fear of students. And it's actually, if you look at the news now, it's becoming genuinely insane. It almost looks as if you're looking at news that's coming out of an insane asylum. There was just recently a man blew up himself and his 2 children, 5 years old and 7-year-old, because the state wouldn't give him custody after his wife disappeared, and they think he murdered her. And all these stories just come out daily. And it used to be that these stories were relatively rare when I was young, that a story like that would be on the news for several weeks. They'd be talking about it and interviewing everyone, trying to figure out what was going on, but they almost can't give these stories attention anymore because they're so common. Now let's turn over to Psalm 8:4, because you could look at all of this and it's almost as if this psalm was written to someone seeing all of this mess that's in the world, and wondering, with all of this craziness that mankind is doing. And as Barack Obama says, we don't have any solution to this problem. In Psalm 8:4 it says, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you visit him? And it's if you look at that question, it's like you could break it down to, what is man? It's why? Why are you going to put mankind over the universe when he's making such a mess of things? And this is when I read this scripture, I think of this as being, it's really a prophecy of Yisrayl Hawkins in these last days answering this question. Because there never was an answer to this question. If anyone was wise enough to even ask it in the first place, there was no one out there that could give the answer to this question. But what is man? It's like what is our purpose? That you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him. Seeing all of this mess that mankind is creating, why are you going to put him over the universe? Now let's go over to verse 10 on page 191. Carrying guns to schools is not a solution. Putting the people in jail is not a solution. Putting away the prophet who tells them they're wrong is not a solution. Putting them in jail won't solve their problems. The only thing that's going to solve their problems is repentance, of course, and then start teaching this to everyone from childhood up and enforcing it. Now let's turn over real quick to Isaiah 58:6. Isaiah 58:6. I can find that. Isaiah 58:6. Okay, and it talks about, is this not the kind of fast that I have chosen to loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke? And it's talking about, the fast of the Day of Atonement, and basically the keeping of Yahweh's laws as loosening the bands of wickedness. But this is where this word solution comes from. When you look at, the pastor is saying that what they don't have for a solution, the word solution comes from the same root as loosen. So this is really talking about when we talk about having a solution to the world's problems, we're talking about implementing this very verse right here. This is what this verse is talking about. It's talking about loosening these bands. And the bands that are being loosened are sin. It's wickedness. The band is the wickedness, and by stopping the wickedness, by teaching righteousness, we'll separate the people from the curses of sin. It's basically by teaching them to stop sinning. That's what the House of Yahweh is all about. And that's kind of in that verse there. And if you look in it's the online etymology dictionary. That word's spelled a little different than I thought it was. But the word solution, it comes from a solving or being solved, and it's from the French solution, and it says a loosening or an unfastening. Okay, so whenever you see loosening the bands of wickedness, just think of the peaceful solution, because that's the same thing. And as the pastor says, they don't have a solution to these problems. We have the solution to the problems, and that's a fact, as it is stated right there in Isaiah, because this is what it's talking about, that we're actually going to provide this solution. Well, let's go over real quick to verse 35 on page 193. And this is, so again I remind you that you can come out of deception strictly by obedience. And that's exactly what's shown in Romans 6:16. One of the apostles, the apostle Shalom, was telling the people that you can overcome this. Well, that's the same thing Yahweh told Cain also. And Yahweh told Cain that the desire to sin is with you and you must overcome it. Now let's just go over to Romans 6:16 real quick. The desire to sin is with you, but you must overcome it. Romans 6:16. For we know, Romans 6:16 is on page 878. Do you not know that to whom you yield yourselves as servants to obey, his servant you are whom you obey, whether sin which leads to death or of obedience which leads to righteousness? And it's the obedience is what gets us to the point where we can overcome deception. Now deception, remember what occurred to Eve. Eve sinned because she was deceived. And remember what it takes to deceive a person. All it takes to deceive a person is a word. And when once Eve was deceived, she had within her this desire to sin, because the deception fundamentally places within a person's heart this desire to sin because they believe they're going to gain something out of it. And so the question is, well, how do we overcome a desire? How do we overcome a desire that's in our hearts? And the way that we do this is by breaking down that deception. Okay, in other words, by showing the one who is deceived that what they believe is not true. Okay, that's basically what it boils down to. That's really what the House of Yahweh does, is we're trying to show the people that this false belief that they have is not true. And eventually, when they take that understanding and they listen to it and act on it, that's what obedience is, they will eventually lose this desire to sin. Okay, and that's what the overcoming process is. First, you have to be taught, you have to understand that you're deceived, and then you have to do what you're taught to overcome that deception, and then the desire, which is called the carnal mind, will then change, and then you can choose righteousness. And this is what the goal is. The goal is to choose righteousness, and the only way you can really ultimately choose righteousness is you have to have a desire to do righteousness. Because the two are the exact same thing. Choosing something and desiring something are the exact same thing. And this is important to understand. Because if a person wants to do something, they're going to do it. It's just that simple. This is the problem with the world. The world wants to stop the terrorists, for example, from blowing up the planes, but they don't do anything about the fact that the terrorists want to blow up the planes. And what they do is they'll put in security systems, and then they'll blow up their brothers and their sisters and their aunts and their uncles so that they get the security systems to stop them from blowing up the planes, but everything they're doing is increasing their desire to blow up the planes. So, and this is what they call a solution, to get them even more angry at them, to get them so that they want to choose to blow up the planes even more. And this is kind of understood even by the word choose, because the word choose, if you look up the word choose, the third definition is to want or to desire. Okay, so when Yahweh says we must choose righteousness, He's telling us that we must desire righteousness. It's the same thing. You can't have one without the other, and you certainly can't have it with millions of people. If you're dealing with millions and billions of people, you cannot. And this is what I think it was Malachi Martin talked about, which I think was one of the funniest parts of his book. He says, in order to control the people, you need to control their hearts and their minds. I don't know if he used the word exactly, hearts or minds. And he said, you can use bombs and guns. He said, that helps, but you need to have the hearts and the minds too. And what he was really saying is, because what he wanted to do and what the Catholic Church wants to do is, they want to use the guns and the bombs to get the hearts and the minds to use the guns and the bombs. Okay, and by putting this hatred into their heart, they do end up doing what it is they want to do, which is kill other human beings. Okay, so what you choose is the same as what you desire, ultimately. Of course, when you first come into the house, you have a desire to sin. You have to fight that. You have to use your mind to overcome this desire to sin, to obey what the house of Yahweh teaches you. And by doing this on a regular basis, you'll find that the desire to sin will go away. And ultimately, you'll get to the point where Yeshua Messiah was, where there's no desire to sin. The whole carnal mind is gone. And then what you have is a holy mind, and the desire is only to do righteousness. This is really where we're trying to get. And ultimately, this is what Yahweh says. When Yahweh says He's going to make mankind into His image, He's saying, when this is done, mankind is not going to have a desire to sin anymore. And he's going to have instead a desire to do righteousness. And as the pastor says, this is going to be true for 2 billion people on planet Earth at that time when this big thing occurs. And this is kind of where we all sit, kind of on this precipice of this huge event that's about to take place, where, it's like the poet says, the best of times and the worst of times. Where, we're about to see, we've got the worst people ever in history. We're surrounded by billions of the most wicked, evil people in history, and in just a few years, or it could be in a month, it could be tomorrow, basically, it's going to start. These people are going to transition from this condition that they're in to worshiping at the house of Yahweh. And but what we're going to see is, we're going to see a transformation in what their desire to do, what the house of Yahweh is going to do, and what Yahweh's plan is going to do is, we're going to change their heart so that they desire to do righteousness. And I wanted to get in a little bit into this, because Yahweh has said this is going to occur. We see this occurring with us, and you could almost look out at the world and you could say, well, we tell these people that they've got to obey and they've got to overcome, and they just look at us funny. So what is it that's going to cause them to change their mind? And it's part of it is covered even in Hebrews 5:8. If you go there in Hebrews 5:8, it talks about even Yeshua Messiah himself, that though he was a son, he learned obedience from the things he suffered. Okay, so part of this obedience, which Pastor says is the only way to overcome deception, part of it came from suffering. And then let's go quickly to Isaiah 10:12. Isaiah 10:12. It's like a pastor says, you're going to burn your hands on the stove, or you're going to listen and not touch the stove. But the vast majority of mankind is going to get their hands burned by the stove. But then they're going to listen. They are going to listen, and this is what Yahweh has said. He's set this in advance in His plan. He's made mankind, and He's made the earth, and He's set the plan out about, so that in the end, the burn is going to do it. And this is is Isaiah 8 in Isaiah 10 verse 18. Isaiah 10 verse 18. And this whole little section here kind of talks about this the end days, and it's really about what the earth is going to be like. It's almost like a recipe for creating righteousness in the carnal mind. How to get rid of the carnal mind, because it shows us here, it shows the nuclear war here, and then it describes I want to use the psychology, but the mind of a person who's going to be transformed, in the world right now, who's going to overcome this carnal mind out there. What's going to change them? And it's in Isaiah 10:18. It says, "And it will consume the glory of His forest and of its fruitful fields, both soul and body, and they will be as when a sick man wastes away." And I thought this was an interesting phrase. Pastor mentioned this a few weeks ago in one of his sermons, and I thought that's really kind of descriptive, as a sick man wastes away, because Yahweh didn't say just as a sick man. He said as a sick man wastes away. And I don't know how many people here have known any sick men that waste away, but you get to a different point in your mind when you're wasting away. And this is like when you get sick. This is what typically occurs to a person. They get sick, they find out they have a pain, they go to the doctor, and the doctor says, you've got cancer, but we've got about 5 options we can try, and they're all working pretty well, even though they aren't. They'll tell them that. And so you go home, and it's like, well, now I can't get my mind off this fact that I have cancer. I can't believe I have cancer. But you still have this hope that you're going to live. Okay, you still have this belief that the doctors are going to fix it. And so you go for your appointments, but then you get to the point where they finally get you in your hospital bed, and they've pretty much, really what they've done is they've exhausted all your funds. They've run the insurance down, and this is literally what occurs in these hospitals. I know it may seem difficult for some people to believe, but you have to go through it to witness it. All the funds will be exhausted. And I know someone who literally, the half hour that those funds were out, he died. Because the funds ran out at midnight on December 30th, and he died 11:30 p.m. And that was the end. They planned the cure, the treatment, so that they can use up all your money. But there is a point where you're lying in bed, and this is where the world is going to get. This is where, remember, all hope of life is gone. Okay, when it gets to the point where all hope of life is gone, this is a man lying in bed wasting away. This is when you get to the point where, no, we already did the chemo, we already did the operation, we already did whatever other experimental things were going to work, and you know what? I give up. I know these doctors are not going to fix me, and something changes in the brain. And Yahweh made us this way, and Yahweh says this is actually, we're going to get to this point with the whole earth is going to get to the point where they're like a man who's wasting away in his bed. And I had a man tell me this who was wasting away in his bed, and he told me it's a very humbling experience. But there was a journalist just recently, and he got esophageal cancer. Okay, and he was in his 50s, and he got esophageal cancer, and he wrote for Vanity Fair, and he was kind of a prolific writer, and he's one of these writers in the world who basically specializes in making stupid things seem intelligent and making intelligent things seem stupid. He would write against us. He would make us look ridiculous. This is what he did for a living. But he got esophageal cancer, and he was being treated for this, and it got to a point where 2 weeks before he was dead, he wrote his last article. And I thought, this is interesting, because here's this man who's totally practiced in expressing himself. And I just thought, this so This so describes the mindset of the way the people are going to be when the nuclear bombs go off and they're wasting away in their bed, sick in their bed. This is how they're going to be when there's no hope of life, because that's the way this man was here. And he wrote his last article, and in his article he writes, "Before I was diagnosed with esophageal cancer a year and a half ago," he said, "I rather jauntily told the readers of my memoirs that when faced with extinction, I wanted to be fully conscious and awake in order to do death in the active and not in the passive sense." So he was almost joking about death. And I do still try to nurture that little flame of curiosity and defiance. Now, this man's dead now. He died a week or two after this article. Willing to play out the string to the end and wishing to be spared nothing that properly belongs to a lifespan. However, one thing that grave illness does, it makes you examine familiar principles and seemingly reliable sayings. Okay, this is one thing that grave illness does. And this is one thing that all hope of life being gone does. It makes you examine familiar principles and seemingly reliable sayings. Okay, this is Christianity, is what he's examining. And there's one that I find that I am not saying with quite the same conviction as I once used to. In particular, I have slightly stopped issuing the announcement that whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Okay, so this is what this man lived by. Whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. And now he's lying in bed and he's had his treatments and he's gotten to the point where he says, I wonder why I even believed that. And he says, in fact, I now sometimes wonder why I ever thought it profound. And then he goes into, because he was being bothered by why he thought this was true, because here what he thought, because what the saying basically says is take risks in life and it's only going to help you out. And what he goes into here is he says, these risks are now killing me. Because he admits he was a sodomite. He admits he was a heavy drinker. And he says, in this article, he says basically, so he looked into the saying to see who it was that wrote it in the first place. And he found out that the man that wrote it died of syphilis. And this is what he said. So he says he seems to have, his name is Nitsky, and he seems to have caught an early dose of syphilis, which gave him crushing migraine headaches and attacks of blindness and metastasized into dementia and paralysis. So this is where this saying goes, and what made him believe this, and this is what we want to avoid here, but this is what the world is, this is when the world's going to listen to us. When they get the diagnosis of cancer and they've gone through the chemo and they're just about to be dead. That's basically that's what the nuclear bomb is. It's like cancer of the earth, cancer of everyone. They've all got it now and they've all tried all the cures and it doesn't work. He says, I do remember, and this is what the suffering he was going through, I do remember lying there and looking at my torso, which was covered almost from throat to navel by a vivid red radiation rash. This is his treatment. This was the product of a month-long bombardment with protons which had burned away all the cancer in my clavicle and paratracheal nodes, as well as the original tumor in the esophagus. This put me in a rare class of patients who could claim to have received the highly advanced expertise uniquely available at the stellar zip code of MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. And this is where they all go basically to die. And there's a story about this cancer center. You can go online and see a little documentary. Almost no one lives. They all die. And this is what the funny thing is. It's like 100,000 patients, and almost none of them actually end up living from these treatments. To say that the rash would hurt would be pointless. The struggle is to convey the way that it hurt on the inside. Okay, and this is where he starts, this is what caused him to wonder why he ever believed what he believed in the first place. Now, he didn't have anything else to go to, because this man wasn't called and he wasn't in that position. The world will. The world's going to have this option now where we're going to say, here's why you believed this in the first place, and this is what you're supposed to believe. But he's in this position, and what he's in is a position where the deception is falling from his eyes a little bit, and the realization that he is deceived. I lay there for days on end, trying in vain to postpone the moment when I would have to swallow. Every time I did swallow, a hellish tide of pain would flow up from my throat, culminating in what felt like a mule kick in the small of my back. I wondered if things looked as red and inflamed within me as they did without, and then I had an impromptu rogue thought. If I had been told about all this in advance, would I have opted for the treatment? There were several moments as I bucked and writhed and gasped and cursed when I seriously doubted it. This is when this man who lived by this saying began to wonder why he even lived by it. And this is what the world actually lives by. It lives by these little sayings. This man can articulate his deception because he's a writer, and that's what he did. He was a prolific writer. He wrote books, he wrote articles, and so he was able to say, this is what I'm living by. I'm living by this saying, if it doesn't kill me, it makes me stronger. Whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. But the average person couldn't really tell you what saying they're living by, but they are living by these sayings. And these sayings are a part of their deception. And of course, the big saying that they're going by is that you can live without keeping Yahweh's laws. You can sin and still go to heaven. And then this is a saying, of course, that this man didn't really realize. But that is the position that these people are going to be in. And this is where, when they have this mindset, this is where we come in. Okay, because the suffering that they're going to go through is not Yahweh's work per se. That is their doing. The bombs would go off with or without us. And with or without Yahweh's plan, mankind would destroy himself without keeping Yahweh's laws. But the big blessing is us being here at just the right time. Okay, we're here right this right time. And this is verse 50, which is page 194. But he's saying at this now of your sowing of the seed of righteousness, because this is our job, which we're doing. We're reaching out to the world right now. Then he says, you can beget someone again here, but not with corruptible seed, but this seed of righteousness then that we plant in the person's mind, and it starts to grow. Okay, this is where they're going to be, these ones that are coming out are going to be in this position where we're going to be able to plant this seed into their mind, because they're going to begin to question their own sayings that they live by. Okay, and this is what's going to make our work so effective. And this is when they're really going to come out and they're actually going to listen to us. It's the humility that comes when a man is sick in his bed and he's wasting away. That's a totally different mindset. Okay, that's when you start to lose all of your pride, and then you start to listen. And this is what we're going to run into. But the seed of righteousness then that we plant in the person mind, then it starts to grow. And if the person will allow it to be fed, and they're going to, not now they aren't, but they're going, 2 billion of them are going to allow it to be fed, because they're going to be so desperate. They're going to actually listen. Then it will grow and become part of this. The greatest tree, which is the kingdom of heaven, of course, the greatest tree of all, as Yeshua described this tree as growing to be a part of that. Of course, if you refuse to let the water flow or the oil flow from the righteous source that Yahweh instituted, then you cut the life off, the righteousness of which is the life, eternal life. You cut that off. Well, nothing can grow then but this corruptible seed that is also in the body. And Yahweh says to Cain, you must overcome. Okay, and this is what this overcoming is. You must overcome the desire to sin. The desire to sin is with you, but you must overcome it. And this is the same as saying you must choose righteousness. You must bring yourself. It's like Yeshua Messiah said, you're a fool if you don't believe all that the prophets have spoken. Which means you're a fool if you don't know all that the prophets have spoken. Okay, because you cannot believe something you don't know. And so that knowledge alone, by studying and listening to what the House of Yahweh teaches, that knowledge alone will help you to overcome. Because part of the reason you desire to sin, part of the reason the world desires to sin, is because they believe they're going to get something out of it. And because they don't really see. They are not to the point where they really see to the point of believing that they're not going to, that the only thing they're going to get is death. And just like this man here said, that no, these things that don't kill you, these risks that you took throughout your life, they did kill you. And then you can now, at this point, it's too late for you to do anything about it. And that's what would occur with us. We can get to the point where it's too late if we don't overcome now. 1 Kepha 1:23, having been begotten not by corruptible seed, but by incorruptible seed, by the word of Yahweh, which is by the teaching of the one sent, Israel Hawkins. So now, at this time, everyone please stand for the great Kohan Pariah.
Hey, Shabbat Shalom, man. Please go ahead and be seated. We're going to continue right on here on page 195, and I just want you to remember everything that Great Kohan was just mentioning here. He mentioned here, back over here in verse 51, he was sitting here, he was talking about this desire, about this desire to sin that was within Cain. And if you remember, he was told, just as he had just mentioned here, the desire to sin is with you, but you must overcome it. And Pastor, it's real significant here. If you look at what Pastor's saying here, he's saying, if you refuse to let the water flow or the oil flow from the righteous source that Yahweh instituted, then you cut the life off. Notice it's we who forsake Yahweh, just like it says in Isaiah 59, verses 1 and 2. It's not Yahweh that separates himself from us. We, by our disobedient attitude, by our rebellious attitude, by insisting on, by practicing rebellion and not submitting to the laws of Yahweh, we choose not to be a part of Yahweh's family. And this is what Pastor is saying here. He says that you cut the life off. Yahweh doesn't do it, but we separate ourselves from that. And the thing to remember, with all of these things that are going on in the world, with all the sickness, with all the disease, with all these things that are out here, we've got to remember that Yahweh is protecting His house. Yahweh is guarding. Just as the title of this sermon, is, as Yahweh guarded the bloodline from Abel to Yeshua, just as He guarded that bloodline and protected that bloodline, He's continuing to protect the work all the way through these last days, and Yahweh is going to see that this work is protected. And we have to believe, again, as the Great Kohan mentioned, all that the prophets have spoken. Only a fool would not believe those things. But Pastor continues over here in verse 54 over here, he says, but here in Yachanan 6:63, and he says, this is something that we need to memorize. We need to have this firmly established in our mind here. He says, it is the Spirit that gives life. I mean, the world twists this around. They think there's some gassy being floating around that's gonna zap life to people. And that's just simply not what the Scripture says. I mean, if they would just read what the Scripture itself says here, it says, it is the Spirit that gives life. It says the flesh is useless. And Pastor says, well, what is the Spirit? The laws that I speak to you, they are Spirit and they are life everlasting. That's what the Spirit is. He says, He is impregnating you with the word of Yahweh, and you have control over it, whether it grows or whether it doesn't. It's up to us. It's our choice. It's through our obedience that it's going to grow, or through our disobedience that it's going to wither and die. You can resist it. We can resist this. We can resist this golden oil. We can cut the water off from it, and we can cut the flowing oil off from it, and it's simply done through disobedience. It's simply done through disobedience. And then Pastor shows the usual translated of this word seed that was mentioned over here. This seed, it's also figurative for the word of Yahweh. And in Matthew chapter 7, where we're warned to beware of these false prophets. And Pastor, he shows here, he says, you can point this out now to a person who's following this, and their minds are closed to it. It's like it can't get through. He's what is it? What is it that shuts off the ability to understand these things? What is that closes the understanding? Pastor's pointing it out here. He says you can point these things out. It's like it can't get through. And he mentions, and he's mentioned marijuana and how the marijuana can keep the brain from actually using new information. Well, there are certain ingredients in marijuana, as Pastor shows, that are identical to the same ingredients found in pork. It's this way that's being followed here. We're being warned. We're being warned against deception. We're being warned against deception. And, Pastor says here in Matthew, shows us in Matthew 7:13 that, to enter it through life, we have to enter through the narrow gate, because wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction. And there's many people that go that way. Revelation 12:9, as we read earlier, shows that the whole world is deceived. The whole world has been deceived into following that way. But we're warned to beware of false prophets, because they will come to you, because they come to us in sheep's clothing. In other words, they're going to appear oh so righteous. If we just listen to their words are going to sound oh so right, oh so appealing. We're going to be, as it says in Proverbs, I think it's either chapter 6 or chapter 7, it talks about the seducing seductress or adulteress, how she entices people with their smooth words. Oh, honey, it's going to be okay. You can come on over to this church over here, and all you have to do is just believe. You don't have to worry about all those old technicalities that are found in that Bible. Just believe. And see, that's what it says right here in this verse. You just believe and you'll have eternal life. That's all you have to have. And that's very appealing. That's very appealing to the carnal mind. Wow, I can get that. I can get eternal life just by believing. I don't have to follow all these conditions. But that's what that's all part of this. That's all part of this deception, and it's a very carefully laid out plan, as we'll see here in just a little bit. But we're shown here that we're shown to beware of false prophets. And Pastor says because they're going to teach you these false prophets, they are going to teach you. Well, how are they going to teach us? Is it going to be obvious that they're teaching us some falsehood? No, it's not going to be falsehood. It's not going to be obvious. That's why it's called deception. But inwardly, they're going to have one appearance on the outside, but inwardly they're going to be ravening wolves. And then Pastor shows here, says, well, you can see the picture right now in the schools of America, how they are like brute beasts. In this word, the word brute means characteristic of an animal. It means in quality or action or instinct. It can mean cruel or savage. Not working by reason. An animal works on instinct. They just react to certain situations. Well, this isn't how Yahweh created us. Yahweh created us with the ability to, and He tells us, don't trust in your own heart. Don't lean upon your feelings, but trust in the law and in the prophets. He created us with the ability to use our minds to follow these laws and these statutes and these judgments. Because in following these laws, statutes, and judgments, these are the things that lead to life. This is that golden oil that will lead us to life. Now, if we choose not to follow those, then we're going to be cut off from that. But this whole world is like brute beasts. They're just, like I say, they're just characteristic of an animal in quality or action or instinct. And this is the same quality that was shown in one of the tribes. And this is the same thing that was that we see, that not only was it shown in the tribes there, that was imitated, and it's always been imitated in the Catholic Church right down to the present day. This same animalistic instinct. You heard the term dog-eat-dog world. It doesn't matter who they step on. They're all out for themselves. It's not the way Yahweh intended it for it to be. The way Yahweh intended life to be is the way it's being practiced here in the House of Yahweh, where you don't have these things, where you've got the care and concern for one another. You don't have this deception. The deception of this veil of deception has been removed, and we know, we know that it is the Spirit that gives life, and that the key to attaining this life is through obedience. Now, in verse 16 here, Pastor shows you will know these people, you will know them by their fruits. Now, of course, if it's bringing forth bitterness and hatred, this countenance it showed on the face of Cain. And Cain, again, remember, Cain was told, that desire to sin. He was told that, if you do righteousness, will you not be accepted? Which is telling you right there, he wasn't practicing righteousness. He wasn't doing what he was told to do. But he said, if you do righteousness, will you not be accepted? But sin, he said, sin is crouching at your door, and then that desire you must overcome. And that desire, again, that is the carnal mind, and that was shown in the way of Cain. And this is what this world exploits. The worldly holidays, The churches, even the churches in the world, the worldly holidays, they all play on emotion. That was a big thing. That was one of the big things with the paganistic religions of the world. It wasn't based on anything fact. It wasn't based on anything scriptural. It was based on emotion. You think about this holiday, this holy day that was just celebrated a couple of days ago. This Valentine's Day. Is there anything scriptural about that? Is there anything righteous in that? Absolutely not. What's it doing? It's playing on the emotions of the people. Oh, if you really love your husband, if you really love your wife or your girlfriend or your boyfriend or whoever, then you're going to make sure that you come here to our store and you're going to make sure that you get them this $150 bouquet of flowers that's going to die in 2 days. And get them this chocolate that's filled with all these pork byproducts and give that to them. Okay, so their minds can be further corrupted, and so that our wallets can get richer. That's what's behind all of these things. Now, the teachings of Yahweh, though, they show us how to get rid of this bitterness and hatred, because we know that the fruits of this world bring forth their bitterness and hatred. The teachings of Yahweh show you how to get rid of that. And we're told simply to humble ourselves as a little child. In other words, we don't need to be acting like little children. Everybody's seen little 2-year-olds, 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds run around. What occurs when they don't get something that they want? They throw a temper tantrum. Boy, they get all mad. They'll stomp their feet, and they'll sit over there in the corner, and they'll do this number. And their lip will stick out, and it's just, you can see the countenance on their face. This isn't how Yahweh's telling us to behave, but what He's telling us to do is to humble ourselves like a little child. Be willing to learn, because children, remember, are like sponges. Boy, they're going to suck up any type of knowledge that's around them, whether it's decent knowledge, whether it's righteous knowledge, or whether it's evil. What is it that we're going to put before them? As parents, we're going to put before them the laws of life is what we're going to put before them. We're going to put before them the peaceful solution so that they know the right and proper way to conduct themselves in the house of Yahweh. Now, Pastor shows here, he says, you can't hold on to your bitter, rebellious attitudes because you shut the valves down from the flow of the olive oil that comes from the branch. Notice this. Remember this root of bitterness. We're warned against allowing this root of bitterness to grow up within us. It's because this root of bitterness, you see how Pastor categorized it here? He categorized it right along with something else. Your bitter, rebellious attitude. This bitter attitude he also categorized as rebellion. He categorized it as rebellion. Now, bitter. When we look up the word bitter, of course, bitter can mean something distasteful or distressing to the mind. It can also mean marked by intensity or severity. It's accompanied by severe pain or suffering. A bitter pain. Exhibiting intense animosity. That's this bitterness. This intense animosity, marked by cynicism. Cynicism is simply something that's being distrustful of motives or disbelief in integrity or in sincerity. The people that have this bitter attitude and speak against our pastor and overseer, they exhibit this bitter, rebellious attitude because they try to deceive and they try to cast doubt on pastor's integrity and on the sincerity of what he's doing and bringing forth the plan of Yahweh. Don't fall for that. Don't listen to it. Correct it. Walk away from it. But it's marked by cynicism and this word I'm having a hard time pronouncing here, rancor, R-A-N-C-O-R. And that simply means deep-seated ill will or enmity. Remember Romans chapter 8:7 that the carnal mind, remember it says, Romans 8:7 says that the carnal mind is at enmity, or it's bitterly opposed, and that's what that means. It's in bitter opposition to the laws of Yahweh. And this is what we've been told that we have to overcome. But, it's our choice. And the scriptures show it's our choice. Pastor shows that it's our choice. And he shows here Pastor shows here, And the scriptures show that in this day and age, in these last days, in the last days, that we're facing very different and very different circumstances than any other group in history has faced. We're facing things that our forefathers never had to face. None of our forefathers ever had to face face nuclear war. The threat of all life being wiped off the face of the earth. They didn't even have to face the threat that enters into the majority, probably 99.999% of all households in the world, which is that idiot box called the television. They didn't even have to endure that little box. Well, how bad can that be? Well, if how bad can that little box be? Well, if it's used for righteous purposes, as the House of Yahweh does use it for preaching and publishing the Word of Yahweh, for teaching the peaceful solution, for bringing out the plan of Yahweh in these last days, then it's for a very righteous purpose. But the way that the world uses it, it's used for deception. Look at if you've read the newsletter, I think it's in the newsletter, the March 2012 newsletter, there's a whole section in there about the entertainment industry and about the types of people that they're catering to. And how Hollywood is actually looking to this particular group or these groups for approval. And they're actually gearing their entertainment. They're gearing their programming toward that group. So that group can then gain acceptance into the minds of the people. And you see it. You see it in the mood, in the political mood. There's a few states, there are a couple of states, I think, here that just passed, I know one just passed a same-sex marriage law, and then the governor turned around and vetoed it. But you see these things coming up more and more, and it's being pushed more and more, and it's slowly gaining more and more acceptance as a normal way of life. Well, it might be normal in the way of the world, but it's certainly against the laws of Yahweh, and it brings nothing but these sicknesses and diseases. But Pastor shows here, he says, in our lifetime, we have not only the strong pull of the propaganda that's put out and put out daily now, the daily preaching comes forth from your television set. If you don't watch anything but the news on the television set, you will get this teaching. You will get this deception. And one of the other words for deception is called subterfuge, which actually it ties in with what's written in Jeremiah 23:26 and 27, where it talks about the prophets who devise, who they plan and scheme to cause my people to forget my name for Baal. Okay, but that actually ties in with that, because we see that this deception or this subterfuge is actually an adoption of a strategy. It's a very, very carefully thought out plan. It's a strategy or telling of lies in order to conceal or to bring about in order to bring out a certain end. And then part of this, and Pastor shows in verse 67, is if they've got the House of Yahweh to talk about, they're going to run the House of Yahweh down extremely. They're going to run us into the ground. They're going to run Yahweh into the ground. They're going to run the House of Yahweh into the ground. Anybody, as Pastor said, who has ever darkened the door of the house of Yahweh, the witness himself, Yahweh himself, they're going to run them right into the ground. And then right behind it, they're going to show you one of the major universities around here with this, and Pastor refers to it as with their dancing basketball girls and boys. And makes them look righteous in doing that. Oh, don't follow those people over there at the house of Yahweh. They're teaching people to keep the Sabbath and the feast days, those cult people. But look at our Sunday keepers over here. Look how much fun they're having and the way that they're dressed. Doesn't that look right? Doesn't that look fun? But that's what they push. That's the deception. That's the deception. That's what they're pushing, and they try to make that appear righteous. And it has nothing to do with righteousness at all. Now, Yahshua warned us. He warned us of this deception. The scriptures, we're warned constantly throughout the scriptures. Beware of these things. Be on guard so that no man deceives you. We've got to be on guard 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We cannot afford to let our guard down, because this deception comes from everywhere. It comes from everywhere. And that's why Yahshua, he warned us of this, and and how easy it is to partake of this and let it start growing in your body. This deception that I've been trumpeting on now for several months or weeks, and in essence here, almost a year and a half, going on almost 2 years here. Pastor has been warning us against that, even longer than that. But he says in verse 17, likewise, every righteous tree brings forth righteous fruit. Did you know that we're the only people on the face of the earth who are keeping Yahweh's appointments that he said in the beginning? We're keeping an appointment with Yahweh here today that Yahweh set from the beginning. And Yahweh says that he will be here during his appointed times. Now, we've got another set of appointments coming up here in about 7 weeks now, when we're going to be reunited with all of our brothers and sisters who are able to be here physically here at Yahweh's house. We're all going to be reunited here for a great feast. Praise Yahweh. Now, the people that don't keep those appointments, who, as we're talking about here, about this rebellion, allowing this rebellious attitude come into here, those who refuse to keep these things, they're bringing forth not righteousness, but they're bringing forth iniquity. And iniquity is what the kings of the east brought forth. They rejected Yahweh's laws, and of course, that is iniquity. And then this is something, Eve was deceived. This is the same type of thing, the same pattern that Eve was deceived into taking. And then Adam was coaxed by his wife, so he said, yeah, I'll go ahead and partake of it too. The dumb cluck, as Pastor says here. But it's that. That's why we have to be on guard constantly. Everything that we do, we need to make sure that all things are being done according to the laws and the prophets. Don't lean upon our own understanding. Don't lean upon the things that we think we know or what we feel. We need to judge righteous judgments, judge things according to the law and the prophets. Again, as the Great Kohan mentioned before me, O fools and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. That should tell us that if they're not in the prophesied house of Yahweh, they cannot bring righteousness to you in any way, shape, or form. So these people who leave Yahweh's house, there is absolutely no way that they can bring any form of righteousness. Not one. Anything they say, reject that teaching. Don't listen to them. Because you're opening yourself up. You're opening yourself up, just as Eve did. We'll be opening ourselves up for falling into this deception. Now, every tree that does not bring forth righteous fruit, now Pastor says, notice what's going to occur if you let that valve be shut off from the one sent, the branch that brings forth this golden oil to you. Now, if you shut it off and you don't accept it, and like the humble child, that's your deciding. See, that's not anybody's choice but our own. And it's the same thing that Moshe told the children of Israel there in Deuteronomy chapter 32. I think it's 32. It's either 30 or 32. He says, I set before you this day life by righteousness and death and destruction. Therefore choose life so that both you and your children may live. We're told to make the choice. We're free agents to make our choice. Nobody's going to force us to choose one way or the other. But it's set before us. It's set before us. And this is what Pastor's saying here. If you shut it off and don't accept it like a humble child, then it's you deciding. It's not me. I'm begging you to take this. I'm telling you it is of Yahweh. This way of Yahweh is of Yahweh. Praise Yahweh. Now, the other thing Pastor was talking about here in this particular sermon, he was talking about the way things were in Galilee, in Israel, and he was, there's a big difference from the way things were there and the way things are today. And he mentions here the way things operated in Galilee was a lot like a co-op. And a co-op is basically a shortened form of a cooperative. And this is what we have. This is what was had here in Galilee, and which was about people helping one another. Now, a co-op is marked by a willingness and ability to work with others. You see any major corporations out there today with the willingness and the ability to work with others? I don't think we're going to see that. How about an organization owned by and operated for the benefit of those using its services? That's a co-op. Do we see that out in the world with the major corporations? No, what do we see out there? What are they after? They're after putting whatever they can, and they're after making their bottom line as big as they possibly can. They're not necessarily after for the benefit of others, for the benefit of those using those services. The great Kahan mentioned earlier, he was talking about the healthcare industry and about the insurance benefits and about the particular drugs and stuff that were being used to treat this one individual who had cancer. Okay? So you see it was used for the so-called benefit of the patient until the patient lost the ability to pay them. Okay, well, in the terms of the world, sorry about your luck, bud. But that's their attitude. They could care less. They got what they needed. They got what they wanted. Now, that's not the way it was in Galilee now or in the Garden of Yahweh. Yahweh had the same thing. They had the tools to work with. Well, how did they get the tools? Well, certain people had skills and they made the tools. And a person who is interested in a particular job can go work with that individual and learn a trade. And he shows there were all kinds of trades. There were some who could take sheep's wool and make thread out of it. And he says now we have a Mr. Own-It-All that has manufacturing plants that put out the whole wagon instead of this piece here, this one working with this one here, making this here, make everything coming together. He says now you have this Mr. Own-It-All that has manufacturing plants that put the whole wagon, but he brings in all the money to him, so now he has control and he has the ability to tell you when you can come to work, what days you can take off, and things like that. So, and Pastor, he shows that's the difference. He says that's the way it was, and it's a big difference in it and the big manufacturing today, where you all live in a city, you go to work for that one manufacturer, and he tells you what days to work on, the holidays you can have off. Again, it's all about him. It's not about working together like we do here in the Yahweh's house, like it was done in the days of Yeshua there in Galilee, like it was done throughout all eras of the House of Yahweh. Now, we also see in here where Yahweh is reestablishing, where he is renewing the covenant. He says, this covenant is the same covenant that I will renew with the house of Yahweh in those days. And a covenant, now remember, a covenant is a formal and solemn and binding agreement between two or more parties. Okay, and this is what we have. This is what we have with Yahweh. Yahweh made a covenant with the people, and it's been made with Yahweh's people throughout all history. And basically this covenant says if we will obey Yahweh's voice by keeping his laws, statutes, commandments, and judgments, he promises, I will be your father and you will be my people, and you will be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. But this is only if we uphold our end of the covenant. And again, this is a binding agreement. It's a written agreement or a promise under a seal. Now we know 2 Timothy 2:19 says that Yahweh knows those who are his because they have a specific seal. And that seal is that those who reverence Yahweh, Yahweh knows those who are his because all of those who reverence Yahweh, they depart from iniquity. And so this is the same thing. This is the same covenant that is being renewed with us today. And Pastor, he shows us here in the scriptures so that if we disagree with Yahweh, if we disagree with Yeshua, if we don't agree with Pastor, then we can't be a part of him. We can't be a part of that work. Two cannot walk together unless they're in agreement. It can't be it can't be done. And Yahweh, he works with us. He works with us for a certain time period, and then once we've proved ourselves either as worthy, as that we're going to be able to be worked with and molded into the shape and into the image and likeness that he wants, or whether we prove to be stubborn and rebellious, and that we're not going to be molded into that image and likeness, then we're going to be cast away. Kind of like the potter and the clay. If you've ever worked with clay, you know that you'll be making something, and if you get a piece of clay that's just too difficult to work with, you're only going to work with that hard piece so long. If it's not going to mold and do what you're going to want to, you're going to take that piece, you're going to take it out, you're going to toss it aside, you're going to grab another piece, get it molded, and graft it in and blend it in, and before you know it, you can't tell that the two were ever apart. But Pastor, he shows in Genesis, he shows that, throughout the scriptures, it's shown that Yahweh has always protected his house. He's always protected his work. And we see that in the bloodline of Yeshua. After the death of Abel, we saw where Seth was brought forth, and after Seth was brought forth, there was a son. Seth had a son. His name was Enosh. And if we notice here in Genesis, I think it's 4:26 here, where it shows, and as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. And it was then that the name of Yahweh began to be invoked again. So the name of Yahweh was again, the laws of Yahweh were again being taught. And then Pastor shows here, he says, if in Genesis 5 we notice, we can see the genealogy here all the way through. You look on down here, verse 6, he says you can see that Seth begot Enosh. Then in verse 9 you see Kenan coming from the same bloodline, and then Methuselah, and then in verse 15 Yared, and then verse 18 Enoch. Then Enoch, look on down to 29, Noah, and you see the righteous seed that Yahweh was guarding. So Yahweh has always guarded. He's always guarded his work. He's always guarded the house. And he is going to continue. Yahweh continues. He's going to continue to protect his house, going to continue to protect this work. And no matter what the world tries, no matter what they think that they're going to try to pull, unless Yahweh allows something to take place, it isn't going to take place. The one thing that we can bank on, the one thing that we can believe and put our whole trust in, and our whole faith and trust in, is that Yahweh keeps all of his promises, and he promises that this work is not going to be allowed to be put in the grave. This work is going to be alive and usher in the kingdom of Yahweh. This generation will not pass until all of these things are perfected, and that's exactly what Yeshua said. And this is exactly what's going to take place. So we see here from all of this that Yahweh is guarding this, and brought down, of course, to Yeshua how Abel's work didn't actually die. He died, but his work didn't die. Seth continued it, Enosh continued it, and then it shows you how it was continued in each generation and each person who Yahweh was guarding there. So it continued, just as it continued all the way through to this last day's work, the work that we're a part of right now. And men, it is 8 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and we'll close here. And next week we'll be on page 201 with chapter 21. May Yahweh be with you and bless you. May Yahweh bless your Sabbath day. And if everybody will stand, we'll go ahead and we'll close in prayer. Great and merciful, loving Father, whose holy and righteous name is Yahweh, your servant Kohan Pariah Hawkins, Father, and I do ask permission to come before you under the headship of our pastor and overseer, the great Kohan Yisrayl Hawkins, and through the authority of your Son, Yahshua Messiah. I do thank you, Father, for this great blessing and opportunity you've given to us, Father Yahweh, to come before you and to serve you on your great Sabbath day. We pray that you bless the hearts and minds of all of your people here this day, Father Yahweh, that you'd strengthen us and guide us, Father Yahweh, and help us always to have these humble hearts and humble attitudes, Father Yahweh, just like little children, that we can that we can accept the every word, Father Yahweh, that proceeds out of your mouth, that you will help us to hear and understand these things, Father Yahweh, and to put away our own thoughts and our own desires, Father Yahweh, and submit completely to you and your will, Father, and that you'll help us in our efforts, Father Yahweh, to overcome and become perfect, Father Yahweh, to be made in your image and likeness, so that we can all be counted worthy, Father Yahweh, to serve you forever in your kingdom. We do love you and praise you, Father, and do ask all these things in your Son, Yeshua Messiah. Hallelujah.